Well, there are several different types of boundaries that will help your marriage to be healthy. We have talked about boundaries inside of marriage in a previous episode, and today we're talking about boundaries outside of your marriage. So that's with family and friends and the opposite sex. We could probably devote an entire episode to every single one of these categories, but we still definitely can't cover every possibility. So we're just going to get the conversation started. So, Dr. Kim, let's start today by talking about boundaries with family, specifically our families of origin and our in laws. What are some boundaries needed in those family relationships?
Yeah, I think every couple at some point is going to experience something with family and they feel like, okay, maybe we need boundaries here, like might be unrealistic expectations. Maybe the family needs to see your marriage as a separate entity. And so I think all those things go into it. So I think the way you might look at it is there something that's going on that really is causing a problem for your marriage? And that could be extended family, something like that, maybe expectations that one of the family origin has that you guys are there for every Sunday dinner. And there's no, you have to be there every Sunday. And you're saying that maybe we want to have a Sunday where it's just us, or maybe we want to do this just maybe once a month or something like that. And so that's sometimes those are hard because you're bucking traditions, but you're
Mm-hmm.
doing that because it's better for your family. Could be in somebody in your family that's unhealthy emotionally, or they act unhealthy around you, and so you kind of put some boundaries about that when you're around that person and what the conditions are. Maybe if it's somebody that overdrinks a lot, that you're not going to be around that person when they're drinking. And so I think anything, and I think one of the things that I see a lot, especially with younger couples when they get married, is really establish themselves as a separate entity from the family of origin. Instead of being, I think, some families, it's harder to break traditions or things like that, or they want to still be involved and don't really respect the husband wife relationship. And so sometimes you have to put some boundaries to just help them see you as we are a separate entity. We're still part of you. We're still part of the family, our family of origin, but we are an entity in ourselves. And so it may take some boundaries to make something like that happen.
Yeah, those are good. Those are, it's funny when you've lived them or seen them. It's very relatable.
Yeah, I think too. I said that a lot of times, family of origin issues with younger families, but I've seen it with couples that get married later, or maybe a second marriage, and so the boundary
Hmm.
there to respect the marriage and let it develop might be with adult kids, and so
Mm.
those are some things. So it can come up in a lot of different ways. I think the key is recognizing it and then together deciding what do we need to do, how are we going to handle this.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we can get a lot more into this too. But if the spouses are not really on the same page, is that going to be a hard conversation? I mean, how do we get that going?
It goes back to communication. I think it's being able
Hmm.
to, and sometimes I have couples come to me with these issues in counseling, and then what we end up doing really is setting some boundaries and figuring out how we can do that and how you can communicate that. So some people may sometimes one may see it as more of a problem than the other, uh, but I think for any of those situations that you want to say, okay, what's the healthiest thing for our marriage? What does this?
Hmm.
How does this affect my wife? How does this affect my husband? And making sure that and trying to help understand each other, which comes back to communication, really listening to your spouse's heart
Hmm.
and why they feel like this is important or why this is something you all need to act on together. So it probably could take a lot of communication, but I think if you get stuck and it's important, I think it's a really good place to go to counseling.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I think that this could be a place where it's really hard to talk about because, we've talked about how our family of origin is our normal. Like it's just it's all we've seen. And so if you're going to try to come in not opposition, but kind of swim upstream against a couple of the things, like say everyone's at family dinner,
Hmm.
nobody's ever asked you to come. They just expect you to come. And so they give you guilt trips if you're not coming. Well, it's going to be pretty awkward to sort through your own feelings about your family and getting, some boundaries set there enough to even talk to your spouse. And it's going to be complex. So I think communication is a key word for sure.
Yeah, I think so, and I think deciding, there may be something that you feel you'd like to see change, but it's not like if you do. I always like to do 1 to 10 scales, but maybe it's a two or
Hmm.
three, and so you talk to your spouse about it, and they're not really seeing it the same way you do, and so if it's not
Hmm.
that important, you can let some things go,
Hmm.
because I think the ones things you want to address are the things that are the eight, nines, and tens that are
Hmm.
really affecting you and affecting relationships.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point because that could be really overwhelming if you're trying to address everything. And I think too, it reminds me of something you said in one of our earlier episodes, Dr. Kim, about never setting a boundary when you're angry, not trying to solve things when you're angry. If you're really heated,
Mm,
wait till later. Um,
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because when I'm angry, I don't think real clear and I might make a impulsive decision. I may make a
mhm,
decision or say something that I regret. And so, right. And doing boundaries, you've got to separate yourself from it and give
mhm.
yourself time to think through it, pray about it, talk to each other about it, and then make a decision.
Yeah, that's good. That's a really good foundation. I think some of the other things we've talked about, just sticking with this family of origin and in law conversation, some other things would be always discussing with your spouse before you agree to family activities or plans, making sure your family understands that your
Mm,
goal is always going to be to honor your spouse. So it's not okay to make them the butt of the family joke or to, bash them or be really passive aggressive or assume they should think the same way as your family of origin because they didn't come from the same family. And then also, really important one, not letting your family's expectations interfere with your own expectations. So there's a lot there, practically speaking, but
mm.
I think those are all really important.
There is. I think with Nancy and I, my parents were really good at this. I don't
Hmm.
think our parents would have been as good, but we didn't. We lived in Oklahoma City and not Houston,
Hmm.
and so we were there for shorter periods of time, and it was a little different situation. Uh, my parents were so good at letting us establish ourselves. We For a while we thought they don't like us because they didn't
Yeah.
call us, but then
Yeah.
they were just wanting to let us establish and give space, and we talked all that stuff out together with them. And but I think from people I see in counseling, my parents were a little unusual in that. I think some people
Mhm.
might see it a little differently. But I think as a parent with children that got married and now I have one granddaughter that's married, just knowing that it's how important it is to give them that space and to let
Mm.
them and not be overbearing, not put our expectations on them,
Mhm.
letting them develop their marriage the way God wants them to develop it. And
Mm.
to me, it's a lot more fun to be there, sure, if they need something, but
Mhm.
to watch them develop that and see where that goes and what God
Mhm.
does in their marriage. And so I think a lot goes back not only on the ones who need to set the boundaries, but in this situation with extended family, how do we handle that as parents of a child that is
Yeah.
married? Things, situations like that.
Mhm. No, that's a great point. That's a great point, and I think that's encouraging because I think even if we haven't seen that done, we could still start to think about it and look at how we're going to approach that as the parents or the in laws. But I also think I want to give some hope to people whose families are not really considering that and they have never probably thought about this. And so to the couples who are feel like they're alone in this because their family is all, used to doing things a certain way, just know that there's a lot of people, a lot of couples
Hmm.
just like you navigating this and you can start to take some steps. It does not mean that you're mean. It just means you're taking the action to put your marriage in a really healthy place and that's actually going to make you be able to relate to your family in a healthier way as well, which is a great thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're not saying it's easy, depending on your
Right.
family of origin, depending on how hard or easy it is, but it's worth it. And the longer you let it go in your marriage, I think the harder it is to come back and do something
Mhm.
because you've kind of told them that it was okay for a long time, and now you're saying it's
Mhm.
not okay. So the
Mm.
sooner you can address some of those issues, the better.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. So let's move on to our own family that we have in our home. So if you're a parent, if you have kids at home, or if you have kids that have already moved on and grown up, What are some healthy boundaries to have with our own kids as they are growing up?
I think I read something this week that I thought was kind of appropriate, and they were trying to talk about as parents that you kind of draw a boundary line around yourself because you want to define
Hmm.
where you end and where your child begins. In other words, it's being a
Mm-hmm.
parent, but still let them become who they need to be. Because kids, they're going to kids push boundaries. I mean, they want
Mm-hmm.
their way, just like we all do, and so they're going to try some different things. The kids are wired to test us, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and see how far they can go. That's just part of them learning and growing.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, maybe a couple of examples say that you have a 13-year-old and they are consistently walking in the bedroom door of you and your spouse without knocking and don't respect your privacy. Well, there's a great place that a boundary needs to be in, that you need
Mm-hmm.
to knock before you come in, or, things like something like that. Maybe you've got child that's maybe they're 8 or 10 and they're interrupting conversations that you're having with other adults without
Mm-hmm.
saying anything. They just come in, start talking, don't wait for their chance. And so talking to them, say, hey, the boundary is, unless it's emergency, um, you stand there, and as soon as we finish that, we'll talk. Or if it's something you think is important, you can say, excuse me, but don't just blurt in. And so part of it is just some life skills I think you're developing with boundaries. And so, I think too, I've seen situations where maybe, well, I had a couple situation where a family was divorced, and so the mom and the daughter lived with the mom, but the daughter got to where she was kind of taking the role of the husband and telling the mom what to do
Oh,
and
wow.
how to do her life and stuff like that. And so the
Hmm.
boundaries had to be, you can't tell me how to run my life. I'm an
Hmm.
adult, and work on some things there, and how are you going to define life together with the two of them moving
Hmm.
forward. So I think those are kind of things. I think the example I thought of with a young child is a kid that throws tantrums and throws themselves in the floor, when they don't do what they want you to do. And
Hmm.
so, the boundary there is helping them see that when you do that, you're not going to ever get your way, that we can talk
Hmm.
about it. There's times we need to say no. And so I think there's a lot of just practical applications we can do with boundaries. And I think they help the situations our kids are growing up. And I think we're teaching them then about boundaries,
Hmm.
what healthy boundaries are. And so as they get to a certain age or get older, they're able, and maybe even with their peers, they're able to set their own boundaries because they've learned that from you and seen the example that you set.
Oh, that's so good. That's really good. I think what I think of when you talk about those, because I'm still living with all those ages and stages. We're kept out of the tantrums now. Thank the Lord. That was so
You
hard.
are.
A really tough span of years
Yes.
with all of my kids going through that and all being pretty willing to state their opinions and make their emotions known. But what I think about is the sooner you're setting the boundary, just like what you said with the families of origin, the sooner you set it and enforce it with the child, the better. Because I found, I had 4 kids within 7 years. And so my first one, we were trying to be so intentional. And then we realized, whoa, we were a little too hard on her. She's just a little kid. By the fourth one, we were just tired. And so we let things slide. And so at a certain point, we
I
said,
know.
whoa, we created a little monster here. And he is wonderful and very fun 11-year-old now, but we had to kind of go back and correct where we had let things slide, because you give the example of interrupting conversations. Oh man, it was harder to go back and correct that. But I found that the sooner we'd set a boundary, it kept us from getting angry with the children, because if we let it slide and we
Yes.
got lazy and didn't make that known, then we would end up getting so frustrated and irritated with the child. But it wasn't the child's fault. It was our fault for not taking the reins as a parent and teaching them what was appropriate in that
Yeah.
situation.
That's really that's really good. Yeah, I think so, and I think that's pretty common. That I remember a girl I saw, and she was probably 16, and she was the oldest of four. The youngest was like 7, and her deal was that
Mm-hmm.
he gets away with murder. There were things they had me doing this and this at this age, blah blah blah,
Yeah.
And so I think some of his parents, you kind of get tired And
Mm-hmm.
you're trying really hard with it. Not that you don't try with all of them, but you're right. You just kind of get tired sometimes, and so sometimes the
Mm-hmm.
last one gets by with some things, and then you realize, okay, we probably need to take the reins in. But one of the things I was thinking in parent, I think it is different with our kids. I think in setting the boundaries that with kids, you want to be really clear with it, and I think helping them understand the why of it. That you're trying to teach them not to interrupt, and because
Mm-hmm.
when you interrupt, that other people may not hear what you're going to say, or maybe those kind of things. Help them understand why you're doing that, and then you got to be consistent with it. And I think sometimes parents fall down
Mm-hmm.
in this situation. So we tell them a boundary, we're very clear about it, but then we let it
Mm-hmm.
slide. Well, all we're doing them at that point is telling them that this really isn't that important, because so you got to be consistent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you've got to be firm with it, but be loving. These are your kids. And I think the other thing that's really important with kids is when you see them honor the boundary, that you praise them. You tell them you're so proud of them. That's so good.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for learning that. That's going to make things better for all of us. Things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. That's good. Yeah, it's interesting too. I'm seeing as my kids are a little older, you gave an example of a teen trying to tell you how to run your life. And so my two older teenagers, 18 and
Yes.
16 now, are starting to see things and say, Mom, you need to do this differently with my brothers. And, I'll say, for me, I'm not going to set a boundary there because there's nothing they can really do, but I'll say, thank you for that feedback. When you have a child, you can do that. And it's just funny because because they see things so clearly with their, infinite wisdom as teenagers.
I know. Absolutely. That's so good.
It's funny. Yeah, it used to rub me the wrong way. And then I was like, what? They actually have no power here. I don't have to address that. I'll just say thanks.
No, it's just, I can remember that. Yeah. And you just think, dude, you're 17 years old.
Yeah.
But, I would just kind of let it roll off too most of the time like
Mhm.
that.
Yes. Yes. It can be difficult depending on the moment. But yeah, it's a lot to learn in these ages.
Well, and
So
yeah, it kind of reminded me. I think my son, I think Grant was probably, he was married. And I think they may have just had their first child. And so we were sitting there talking one day, and he just said, "Hey, I've never told you this, but I want to thank you for all the things you taught. How you and Mom set. I don't know if you use the word boundary, but basically set boundaries for us. How you use those
mhm.
things to teach us, and all those things that I got mad about or didn't like then. I just want to thank you that you did it. And so a lot of times
Oh
that comes
wow.
around later, and that was really it was really meaningful that he said that and really believed it. And then I've seen
Mhm.
him carry that out as he's raising his kids, that he's taking those things from us that he thought were effective and helped him, and doing the same thing with his kids. So that's pretty cool too.
Yeah, that it really is very cool to hear that. Well, that's awesome. So, okay, as we're talking about kids getting older, let's talk about boundaries with adult kids.
Yeah. I see a lot of people not set boundaries. I think you've got to let your kids grow up. You've got to make them take some responsibilities. So I think depending on the situation, a lot of times you're financially supporting the child, maybe through college or whatever. But there comes a time you've got to begin to reduce that, or say, by 2 months you're going to have to do your own car payment, or
Mhm.
next month you need to pay your own utility or a phone bill or something like that. I think you want to help them establish that. So maybe you go and you help them set up their own bank account and say, okay, now then this is yours, and money goes in, there's yours, and you got a budget, you got to take care of it. That you don't continue to mix money, things like that. It was
Mhm.
kind of like when I was in college, I had a credit card I could use. There were limits on it that was part of my dad's, and then graduated from college, got married, and that credit card wasn't available anymore, and which was
Mhm.
good because I,
Mhm.
I needed to know that at 20 years old, it's like, oh yeah, I've got to take care of things myself. And so I
Mhm.
think I think that's really important. Just that break, some of those things that you do for your kids that are great when you're doing them as kids, but to
Mhm.
let them know really along the way that there's going to time that goes on you. And
Mhm.
kind of set that time and let them know that. I think that's really
Mhm.
important. Um, I think there's still a tendency, like we all have when our kids are younger, to want to rescue them. And I think
Mhm.
it's okay to let them make mistakes and suffer the consequences, um, because you learn from them a lot.
Mhm.
Uh, I think Nancy and I, when we look back, that we learned so much from the mistakes we made, honestly,
Mhm.
because we were able to say, okay, we got to do something different here. This isn't working.
Mhm.
And I think, how long do you let your kids live with you? If it's after college and they're working, do they need to be paying rent? I mean, things like that
Mhm.
that you need to do just to helping them adult. And I think a lot of kids have trouble adulting today.
Mhm.
Just some of it's probably the pandemic, some of it's just our culture of where we've been at this time. And I
Mhm.
think too, making sure that as adults that you build, our goal was to have an adult relationship with our kids. That needed to
Mhm.
change from a parent-child relationship. And so the way we did that was really just backing off a lot and let them make decisions, and knowing that we were there, sure, if they needed something or wanted some advice or something. But it was always something that too, if we gave advice, they always knew that if you don't take it, it's okay. We're not going to watch
Mhm.
what you do. We're not going to tell you that, say something to you if you don't do what we tell you to do. And so I think that's
Mhm.
good, helping them establish their own autonomy so they know they can make good choices and be responsible for them. Um, all those kind of things. And then supporting them, supporting the kids in the choices.
Mhm.
Maybe you've got a child that got an engineering degree and they've also an artist, and they decide, hey, for a year, I want to see if I can make this art gig work.
Mhm.
Financially, I can do it on my own and everything. And instead of going, you just got this engineering degree, what do you mean you're going to take a gap year to see if you can do art? Well, no, support that.
Mhm.
I think, and let them do that because they're going to learn from it. Maybe they become a great artist
Mhm.
and they make a lot more money out of art than they would have an engineering job, but they need to do that. And so if you're like the
Mhm.
situation I'm thinking, he was a single guy. Um, he wanted just to see if he could break into that, if he could do that, if people would like
Mhm.
his art. And so what he ended up doing at the end of the year, he got an engineering job, and art is a hobby now. And
Mm.
so he still might enter something in art shows and stuff, but that's not, at this point, that's not his bread and butter. But I think if the
Mhm.
parents would have just stopped him from doing that, I think it would cause some resentments. And I think it, it,
Mm.
it was very helpful that they had that adult child had their parents' support in that situation.
Mm. So, okay, when you're saying
So those
support
are
in
kind
that
of I
situation,
went all over the place, but there's a lot.
yeah. No, there's a lot. So I have a follow-up question on that. When you're saying support in that situation, do you mean financially or emotionally or both?
Emotionally, I think
Mhm.
he needed to. Now that doesn't mean that there might be situations where you might not, you might help somebody, but
Mhm.
in this situation, it's basically this: if that's what you want to do, that's great. You've got
Mhm.
your side job and you've got some income that comes from that,
Mhm.
and you're willing to live on that while you explore art for a year, then that's great.
Mhm.
Say, yeah, go for it. We want to see
Mhm.
what you do. We want to see your art. We want to come and look at it. Those kind of things.
Mhm. That's great. I think I really want to clarify on that because I think we learned quickly when after Brian and I got married, that there's a lot of different assumptions about how parents would support their adult children. So a lot of people we heard referring to getting financial support even as a married couple or getting help or gifts in that way. And that's not something we were familiar with, but it was interesting because people would assume everyone does what I do. So everyone would think, no support. We have
Mm,
none of that. Or some people would think, well, everyone gets support, everyone gets help. So I think it's good to define this because we're all coming from different contexts and experiences, and I think it's important to know that that's okay.
yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think any situation is unique, very
Mhm.
definitely. I've had people I work with that the parents gave X number of dollars to help them have a down payment for a house, and that was just a
Mhm.
gift, wasn't anything to be
Mhm.
paid back. And so I think there's a difference also when you're doing something to help them as a gift. I think loaning money to anybody is usually not a good idea, not family or friends,
Mm.
just because there becomes a barrier there. And what if you've loaned your child some money and they're not paying it back, and it's tense when
Mhm.
you're around them. And so I think there's a to
Mhm.
me it was always Nancy and I always decided if we're gonna, with friends or family, we're not gonna loan anybody any money. We're gonna say no, but
Mhm.
we might give it, and
Mhm.
just because we don't want any strings attached to that. Um, So I think each situation is different, and I've seen parents that jump. I'm thinking of a guy that went through med school, struggled, was paying off his own stuff, but as he set up his practice, his parents invested or gave him a gift to
Mm.
help with his office or something like that. So there's
Mm-hmm.
I think you just have to be wise and prayerful in your choices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's good. And I think I think it's good that in a lot of ways it's not right and wrong. It's just situational. And I think God can lead you wherever you are, in which situation you're in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's good. I feel like there's a lot to flesh out there. I wish we could spend more time talking about each of those because those are a lot to learn how to have those good boundaries.
It is, and I think that I think it is. I think sometimes we think, well, one stage is easier than the other with it, but probably the adult kid thing, I see a lot of people struggling with that. And it
Mm-hmm.
seems like, well, I see it both ways. I started to say it seemed like I see it a little more with singles, maybe single
Hmm.
women. So, again, it goes with each situation and what's going on in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and one thing I'm realizing more and more is that you're with if you're able to live a long life, your adult relationship with your kids will last probably a lot longer than your parent child rearing years with them. So there's a lot to navigate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the relationship we have with our kids, and I love as adults and talking about adult things
Mm-hmm.
and just having those as your best friends of your kids as adults, and that's really
Mm-hmm.
fun. And I didn't want to parent longer than 18 years anyway. That
Yeah.
was long enough. It was time to let go of it.
That's a great point. Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Well,
You
this is
know,
reminding me of
yeah,
the conversation we had a few months ago. We had a good conversation about parenting mindset and ways to parent your children so you can be friends as adults. So I'll put a link to that episode in our show notes because you shared so much good wisdom on that topic,
yeah,
and I think that could be helpful. Um,
yeah.
so that
I think it's such an important goal for us to have.
Oh my gosh, yeah. But it's not easy when you're in the thick of it, with kids at home.
No,
Yeah. Okay, so that we can put a pin in that. I can stop asking questions for my own sake of counseling. So let's move on to boundaries with exes or co-parents. What are some good basic standards to
Mm.
have there?
Well, I think the main thing is do everything you can to eliminate conflict, at least from your end.
Mm,
I have very few parents that I see that are divorced that are able to communicate healthy. Honestly, there
mm,
seems to be junk that gets in the way. I think one of the things that the boundaries, if there's a visitation custody schedule, that you follow it,
mm-hmm,
that you have a parenting plan and make
mm-hmm,
sure you're doing what you need to do. Um, and if your ex is a narcissistic or a high conflict person or a toxic person, you just don't want to buy into those. Probably one of the reasons you're not with them is because that was not something you could live with. And
mm,
so I've got couples that only communicate by text, and it's very to the point, and most of the time just includes logistics of when
mm-hmm,
to pick up, or there's a program. Your son wants you to come to, things about those kind of things. I think with the next two, some things that I think are really important are only to communicate about the child. Um,
mm-hmm,
you don't talk about your current marriage with your ex. You don't talk, those kind of things. That if with an ex, the reason that you guys are still in contact is because of this child, and so you keep
mm,
your communication about that child only. Um, don't when someone, I think it's always kind of scary when a couple's divorced and one starts dating, it looks like it's getting serious. I mean, you can't pick your ex's spouse. And I think your only concern should be, how does this person treat my kids? Other than that,
mm,
you really don't have a right to say anything in a situation like that.
hmm.
Just do what you can as a parent. I mean, sometimes your boundaries you might set with an ex, or you're have the boundary, but they don't even know what it is because they're going to fight it
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. And so you are concerned with your parenting, so you don't tell them how to parent. You just do the best you can.
Mm-hmm.
When you have the kids, you teach the kids, and I've always seen there comes a time when the kids see the difference. Um,
Hmm.
so that seems to happen just regularly. And I think the
Hmm.
other thing, the boundary is don't badmouth your ex or the co-parent, any of those kind
Mm-hmm.
of things like that. Just don't
Mm-hmm.
do that. That's not going to go anywhere. Kids will be confused with that. Sometimes kids will use that against you
Hmm.
because they'll tell the other and they'll try to get something out of the other. I mean, kids are just human. They're going to try to,
Mm-hmm.
if they figure they can get between the two parents and get their way, most kids are going to do that at least once or twice.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are just some things. I think they're tough situations. I've seen some couples do it incredibly well, where they really
Hmm.
uh, went for what's best for the kids. They communicated well about the kids, and they kept it just the kids. And so that's the healthiest way to do that. If you've got two healthy people that are trying to do this in a healthy way, that's the ideal. Unfortunately, that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't always happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I love that you're saying you can still personally decide how you're going to respond and interact. And I think that would help eliminate some potential for conflict for sure, which is a great thing for everyone.
Absolutely. I think you realize we can't control other people. And I think the sooner we realize that and realize the only thing you can do is with yourself, and then with God's help, you do the very best you can. And, what that other
Mm-hmm.
person does is you can't control that. And I think that's hard to
Yeah.
accept sometimes, but it's essential to get there and accept it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's really helpful. And so, okay, let's move on now to our next category is boundaries with our friends. So, this one, you gave us a great example of when you guys were first married and your buddies would come over to watch the game. They just swing on by anytime. I lived that in my marriage as well. I came home. Brian and I both worked in the service industry, waiting tables, and we worked opposite shifts naturally as newlyweds. It was awful. So I would get home and find just a bunch of dudes at my house, and I was not into that at all. So we had to have a conversation about, yeah, we need to have a plan before people just swing by anytime. What are some other boundaries to set with friends?
I think I think you're cautious about what you say to your friends about your marriage.
Hmm.
You always need, I think women especially, but guys do too. We need somebody to confide in, but you don't want to try to pitch your friend. You want to try to make your friends take sides in your marriage,
Hmm.
or anything like that. I think too is being really cautious with things that are private between the two of you, that you
Hmm.
don't just share everything. And if it's something that you have a question about, that you take time to ask your spouse,
Hmm.
hey, I would like to talk to Bob about this. Is that okay? And then
Hmm.
if your spouse says no, then it's no. I think
Hmm.
too, another thing, just kind of think, if you're with a group of friends, that you don't say or do anything in front of them that you would not say or do if your spouse was there. Just to
Hmm.
kind of, I think that's a good kind of filter to put things through. And so I think, and
Hmm.
then the other big things I think are the fact that you want your friends, just like your family of origin, to see you as a separate entity, to see you strong, that you want to model marriage for them. And so if you have unhealthy friends in your life, it may be time to say, either put boundaries about it and say, this is what we need you to do, or just back out of that relationship. I see that a number of
Hmm.
times with couples when they get married, especially couples get married younger, 20s, something like that, that there may be somebody that the guy was really good friends with, great guy, but he's kind of a
Hmm.
drinking buddy, and the guy you hung out
Hmm.
with and so getting into marriage, that relationship just not healthy anymore. That was
Hmm.
something for that single season of your life. That's not something that you bring into your marriage. So you have to put some boundaries on that relationship, or maybe you
Hmm.
eliminate that relationship. And those things are okay. Don't
Hmm.
resent them, because they're going to make your marriage better. And if your spouse sees you choosing someone else over them, that's never going to go well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. That is not going to go over well. No, not at all. And I think a lot of
No.
the ones you shared, it's a lot of just the idea of going from me to we. So you're considering your spouse.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. There are a few other ones that we thought of that were not agreeing to plans or committing to plans without talking to your spouse first. And that includes inviting a bunch of people over to your house. um, and then also if there's a plan.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I how did you handle when you walked in and all these guys are
Oh
sitting
gosh.
around? How did you help? How did you communicate to Brian that
Oh.
this isn't really good?
I think it was some good old nonverbal communication. I can remember pulling up and they were like, I think they had a grill. They were grilling out on the front porch or something. And I just think I just like,
Oh yeah.
I came in the door. I probably slammed the door, probably like stomped off. I just didn't even know what to do. Oh, yeah.
Because you
And
had no idea they were going to be there till you pulled up in the drive.
no, I did not know. Of course, no one else was married yet. So I was like the one mean wife, at the
Right.
time. It was just not a good look for
Yep.
anybody. It was like, what's up with her? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and so we got that under control pretty quickly because it was pretty embarrassing for both of us, We did not want to repeat that. Yes.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, I loved when you shared a similar story of your guy friends just showing up because it's like, okay, phew, we weren't the only ones. That's good. We just didn't think to talk about it.
No. Yeah, and I think it is
Yeah.
I think when you have a group of friends that you're around a lot and you're the first ones to get married, I think you experience things like this because nobody else has experienced marriage. So they're not thinking about the way
Mhm.
you are. And it's just like, hey, like with Nancy, she's great. She's kind of like
Yeah.
a new buddy. And no, it's going to be different. She is a wife. She is
A little
not
different.
the new
Yeah.
buddy in the group.
Yeah. Yeah. I would come home because I was waiting tables. And so it was like talking to people endlessly, talking and talking and talking. And then I would get home and be like, finally quiet. And it was not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, okay. So this leads me really well into the next one that I would like to articulate here is if you do agree with your plans, with your spouse, if you guys agree not to do something, please don't throw them under the bus. Don't say, oh, I would love to do this, but he said no, party kill, so I think that's an important one. When you agree to things,
Yes.
be a united front.
Yes.
Yeah. I also think I think it's very valid to discuss, is it okay if friends drop by? If so, who and when? Like what time at night, what time in the morning, whatever on the Saturday. Just articulate that. They really can't hurt to articulate that. And are there some friends that we aren't really that comfortable with, that aren't as healthy for our marriage, and that we don't quite feel like we would want to have stopping by, or would rather not prioritize plans with? I think these are all good topics.
I do too. Those are really good. I think too, I thought about, we've kind of talked about the guys having drop bys. I remember a couple where really her best friend was always coming over all the time. And every time he'd come home from work, the best friend would be there. And so they had to talk about that. And she had to talk to her friend, there's certain time you can't just drop by. There's times that I want to be with you, but we've got to put more structure on it now that I'm married. So it goes both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'll go ahead and I'll tell on myself too, because Brian was doing, random cookouts a couple of times, but I would do the reverse. I would plan, I was still in college when we got married. And so I was kind of acting like a college kid, not, I wasn't doing anything crazy, but I would have girlfriends that used to be my roommates before I was married. So I would come back for girls' night and have a sleepover. We would watch rom-coms. We would eat popcorn. It was a great time. We would have girl talk. And so there were times I planned those kind of spontaneously and didn't really talk to Brian. I would just say, hey, I'm going to be out tonight, which now that I think about it, I wouldn't do that now. But as coming from that background of having a house full of roommates where there was always girl stuff going
Sure.
on, I didn't really think about calling the girls first, telling them what was going on first. And I really had to make a conscious shift to making him my first go to.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes. It was a different vibe, but we we figured it out.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, okay, so finally, Dr. Kim, let's talk about the category of boundaries with the opposite sex. So this is something as a counselor you've seen a lot. So what are the non-negotiables you suggest for all couples?
Yeah, and I know some people are gonna go, well, that's rigid or that's archaic, but my experience is that because the first one is never be alone with someone of the opposite sex. I just I just think it's not worth it. I think I've seen way too many affairs start that way, and the people
Mm,
would all say, "Never thought I'd have an affair," and I was working with this person, and so yeah, we
mm,
had to meet together a lot for our job, or we would have a lunch together or dinner together because we're working on a project. It's just not healthy. And so if you're
mm,
what I counsel them, if you're in a work relationship and you have to have dinner with or lunch with someone of the opposite sex, take somebody else along, have your spouse come, put a
mhm,
third person there if it's all possible. And then I think too, you can also, I had one guy that usually he did that. He ended up not realizing that the person he was meeting was a woman because she had kind of a name that could go either way for a
mhm,
business lunch. So it's when he got down at the table, he said, I need to call my wife. And right there in front of me, he said, Hey, I'm having lunch with so and so. I just want
mhm,
you to know we're at so and so, and I love you.
mm,
Well,
mhm,
that sent a huge message to the other
mhm,
person. Not that the person was going to think about doing anything, but just set a boundary up there of,
mm,
here's the line you don't cross. Um,
mhm,
I think you got to make your boundaries clear, even with people like doctors or professionals, things like that,
mm,
because we hear some things that go on there. Just don't put yourself in a
mm,
situation with the opposite sex that makes you uncomfortable or makes you feel unsafe or makes you feel you're
mhm,
vulnerable. Or and the vulnerability is it. If you're attracted
mhm,
to someone, don't put yourself in those situations. Just
mhm,
don't. The same thing
mhm,
with not being a social media friend with old boyfriends or girlfriends. I know a lot of people do that, but people forget there was a reason that's an old girlfriend or boyfriend. You broke up with
mhm,
each other at some point for some
mhm,
reason, and it wasn't because the relationship was great. And so that grass can look green all of a sudden, or greener than
mhm,
where you are. And so I think you have to set boundaries. I know a lot of couples that their Facebook page or something is the both of them together,
mhm,
and that's okay. And it's okay if you don't, but make sure your spouse has access to all those things, and that you keep really healthy boundaries in the things that you post and the things that you respond to.
mhm,
I think texting people opposite sex, just casually for fun, unless your spouse is on the text as well. I
mhm,
mean, Nancy, most of the texts I send or I interact with people or friends, Nancy's on the same
mhm,
thing with that.
mhm,
And if you have to text things for work, you keep it at work. It's not, hey, how's
mhm.
your day doing? Or, how's that mean wife of yours? Or, you
Mm,
don't do things like
gosh.
that. You just don't
Yeah.
open those doors.
Mhm,
Uh, and if you do begin to feel yourself emotionally attached, because usually that's going to start first, or physical attraction, whichever it is, you shut it down. It's not worth
mhm,
it. It's not worth even that quick fix of just feel good, be around that person or talking to that person. You just don't need to go there. What it shows you is there's
mhm,
something missing in your marriage, and you need to go to your wife
mm,
or your husband and say, I felt vulnerable, and
mhm,
this is an area we need to work on. Let's work on this together. Do you think we need to go to counseling to work on this? Let those temptations turn you back into your marriage, into doing what needs to be done in your marriage, and build
mm,
on that. This is a person you stood in front of God at some point and said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with you. Well,
mhm,
sometimes it takes a lot of work to make that happen. And so turn yourself back into that. So you shouldn't get any needs met in a relationship outside of marriage that are designed to be met in marriage, from communication first to obviously physical relationship, all those kind of things.
mhm,
Um, and if your marriage is in trouble, turn into it. Focus on
mhm,
fixing it. Don't share about it, vent about the opposite sex. Don't go looking for a quick fix. Work on your marriage. And those are the things, those kind of boundaries with the opposite sex and how you handle things are going to put a wall around your marriage of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think 10 years later or a year later, even, you're ever going to regret doing that. All the other
Mm-hmm.
things, the opposite of what we just talked about, you're going to regret. At some point, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
regret that. It's going to come back and bite you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Those are all, I think, really solid recommendations. And I do think too, if there's pushback on those boundaries, I think it's important to say why. Like, what is to be gained from not having the boundary? I don't think there's much. Um, and I think a lot of us, you've said often
Right.
that we're the most vulnerable when we don't think we're vulnerable. So I think a really great practice in the first place is you just have to be really honest with yourself and with God and just say, Lord, search my heart. And when you have those,
Mm.
thoughts of like, well, I don't need this boundary. I can do without it. Why? Ask God to help you search your heart and help you be humble and admit the vulnerability. Because if you don't admit vulnerability, then you're, I think, at your most vulnerable.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
It just, and the other thing I think is important probably to say here is that temptation is not sin. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was tempted, and we know Jesus
Mm-hmm.
never sinned. And so, because you're tempted does not mean you've done something wrong. We're all
Mm-hmm.
going to have temptation. It's what you do with that temptation.
Yeah.
Do you lean into it, or do you back away from it, or run from it? That's probably the best thing
Mm-hmm.
to do is run from it, because we are all vulnerable, and you know what? I think we always people that I talk to that get in affairs. It's like, I just didn't think it was do anything that we just met at the coffee bar every morning and just talk for a while.
Mm.
Those, you're just planting seeds, and it can take the next step so easily, and so you just don't want to go
Mm-hmm.
there.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And I think too that we've shared a few stories of affair recovery on the podcast. And that's kind of a theme they've shared is I didn't really think it would go anywhere. And then suddenly, boom, and I've heard the analogy that sin is like when we entertain a temptation or we kind of nurture a temptation, it's like playing with a baby tiger because you think it's cute and cuddly. And then suddenly, before you know it, that thing has teeth and it will take you down. It's not worth playing with.
Yeah, that's a great example. Absolutely, that's a great visual.
I thought so too when I heard it. I was like, "Yep, that's that's about right." So I think I've experienced in my relationship or in my marriage, we do the same thing you do with not texting opposite sex, unless for work there might be occasional things. But if we're going to be bantering, it's with a group, where Brian and I are both on it. Not everyone has the same boundaries. So there have been times where I've received a text from a male friend and I have just not answered. Is that okay? I didn't say I'm setting a boundary with you. I just didn't answer it.
Mm. Yeah, that sends a message.
Mm-hmm. Because I'm like, I don't even want to get into the conversation. It's not really his business. I just tell Brian, hey, this is kind of weird, but got this text. Here it is. I'm not answering.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I think it's, um, yeah, because if you do, or I think that was the best decision. Sometimes it
Hmm.
sends a message, and I think I was just trying to think if there's any exceptions that we have now. Most of, we have a group that we're very close to, and we're all on the
Mm-hmm.
same thread all the time
Mm-hmm.
of talking to each other. And I think the only time I think Nancy or either one get a text from somebody of the opposite side has to do with work,
Mm-hmm.
and you answer the text, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
A guy will text Nancy, I wanted to show this house that you have listed. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that's the way they communicate. So she
Yeah.
says yes, but she doesn't go, how's your marriage? How y'all doing? How you
Right.
doing
Right.
today?
Right.
Last time I saw you, you looked a little down. I hope you're better. No, you don't
Oh
do
my
that.
gosh. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I think that guideline that you gave
Yeah,
before about friends is if don't say or do something you wouldn't be comfortable saying or doing in front of your spouse. I think that's always a great guide.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Well,
And the other thing
Oh,
is think about, well, I just say God's always there.
mm-hmm.
And to me, if when I keep that in perspective, it makes me think twice about
Mm-hmm.
doing something that I think would not be good for healthy for me, my marriage, or anyone else, because God's always there, and He's not
Mm-hmm.
only there as He know what we do, but He's also there to say, "Hey, you know what I'm feeling right now, God, help me get out of this," and use Him
Yeah.
as your way out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because scripture tells us when we're tempted, he will provide a way out. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you. That's great news.
Yep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think maybe it's worth mentioning before we get off of this topic that as a married person, if you've been married for any number of time, at some point you will experience those temptations. The grass will look greener somewhere else. And like you said, Dr. Kim, that doesn't mean you've sinned, but you do need to be honest with the Lord and find the way out.
Absolutely. Let somebody else mow that grass,
Sure.
mow your own grass.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Use some fertilizer. Well, this has been a really helpful conversation. We have covered a lot of territory here. I feel like we've opened up a lot of conversations. So, what is your final piece of advice to kind of close this conversation down today?
Well, a couple of my hopes for this is sometimes we don't realize all the ways that boundaries can help our marriage. And I think going through some of the things like we did today, from family of origin to friends, to kids, to adult kids, the things that or to exes, those kind of things that we all face. And so what I would encourage you to do is kind of think through those relationships. Sit down together and think through those relationships. How healthy are those relationships? Do we need to have those relationships? Is there a boundary that would make those relationships healthier or better for us? And so hopefully this will spur some discussion between the two of you, depending on what stage of life you're in and which one of those are most applicable to you. And I would encourage you to, if you see something that needs to be done, take that step and make that decision together.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. And that gives us a great place to start making this really tangible. So yeah, that's great encouragement. Thank you for that, Dr. Kim. So as we wrap up this conversation about boundaries outside your marriage, take that encouragement with you to make it practical. And now we've talked about what boundaries are, types of marriage boundaries that can help. And then next week, we're going to get more specific about how to set boundaries. So make sure you tune in and don't miss that episode. As always, you can reach us at any time at info@awesomemarriage.com or in our DMs on Instagram. We love to connect with you and we answer all of our emails. So thanks for sharing your time with us today. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.